Rajat Sethi, economist, joining us. Mr. Amar Patnaik, Rajya Sabha MP of the BJD. Also Amitabh Dubey, who's a member of the Congress and a policy analyst. All of them with us this evening. Rajat Sethi is part of the problem, from a political point of view. The kind of rhetoric the BJP gets trapped in, like Mr. Chidambaram rightly reminded us, you did have the BJP saying back in 2013 that we'll bring it back to 40. I have old bites of the Prime Minister tweets, at the kind of jibes that were made at the UPA government at that time. So is there a lesson from this about this kind of rhetoric?
See, on certain fronts, Nidhi, there are some rightful comparisons between 2013 and 2022. But one thing that stands different is that among all the major economies, and I can pull out data for that, India's retail inflation back in those days was worst hit. Compared to that today, we all understand how there is an import of inflation. This happens because, we all know that the US Fed mismanaged the situation. US inflation shot up. Because of that, they had to increase the interest rate. There was flight of capital from emerging economies like India, and therefore the import bills exceeded. And this is how an American problem was brought into India, and the inflation has risen as we see. But keep in mind one thing, that this is still within a manageable range. Look at the other economies which have historically been suffering with deflationary tendencies, like Japan and like Italy and like various other European countries, as well as US. They're all staring at 9 to 10% of inflation, which was absolutely unheard of in those countries. At this stage, policymakers in India, they're grappling with this impossible trinity. How do you manage your interest rate, your exchange rate, and your reserves? Handling all these three things, you can at best do justice to two. You will still have to do away with one. Therefore, I think what the government is at this stage thinking is that let us not chase, some kind of a hypothetical level. Allow, the prices to come down. And this is where I believe I do not agree with Chidambaram-ji is. See, US is staring at recession, a technical recession. They already had a quarter of recession, the previous one. This quarter, if it again goes recessionary, we will call it a technical recession. The fuel prices, the crude fuel prices around the world are already facing the recessionary pressures. The crude has gone down below $100 a barrel to around $90, if I'm not mistaken, $90. It's going to further go down and stabilize around $55 to $60. That's what
Rajat Sethi, my point very simply...
This is an important point.
Yeah.
This is a very important point. So if the fuel-related inflationary pressure reduces, countries like India will not face a very elongated or an elaborate season of high inflation. This is what experts
But
believe.
we are, I think these are words of cold comfort. Amitabh Dubey, if you want to come in on that, because when we hear the government saying that, our fundamentals are strong, our economy is in a relatively better position, that might be the case, yes, and in certain areas. But at the moment, it's cold comfort to people who are facing, higher GST slabs on essentials, inflation, which has also been in double digits now for more than a year. Therefore, what's the way out, Amitabh Dubey?
Yeah, so, as Mr. Chidambaram said, there's a very serious impact on our imported goods, and 80+% of our goods are dollar denominated, including our oil, 86%, coal, and so on and so forth. Mr. Modi came to power, arguing for a strong rupee, and he's delivered one of the weakest rupees we've seen in decades. In fact, I think he himself said, जिस देश का रुपया उसी देश का गिरता है जिसकी सरकार भ्रष्ट और गिरी हुई है. These are his own words. And the rupee declined by about 21 rupees under Mr. Modi in 8 years, compared with 14 rupees in the whole decade of Dr. Manmohan Singh. So I think the first point is that the government has put itself in this position of having to defend its record on the currency. The second point that was made was about imported inflation. Even the 2013 taper tantrum was an imported crisis because the US Fed began to taper its purchases of bonds. And that had a big impact on emerging markets, including India. Now, if you look at what the IMF is projecting for India now, we're talking about a comparison between previous crises and this one. India's current account deficit is actually projected this year to be one of the lowest amongst all countries or all emerging and developing markets. So we also have severe vulnerabilities. So I would say we shouldn't be too overconfident that we have ridden out this storm.
All right. Amar Patnaik, if you wanted to come in on that, do you think the government is doing enough?
No, so just as Mr. Chidambaram was saying, there are two actors here, the RBI and the government. I think the RBI has done its bit or is doing its bit, started by buying the, releasing from the foreign exchange reserve, but hasn't really delivered, because I think there has to be a unanimity that a lot of this crisis is something to do with strengthening of the dollar outside globally, and also which Mr. Chidambaram just referred to as contextually different with 2013 and the current crisis. It is actually contextually different. We were already having the supply shocks and therefore commodity prices already increasing post-pandemic, and then the inflation was already rising, and then the Fed cut takes place, and therefore the currency depreciation takes place, dollar gets strengthened, flight of capital takes place. So what the government must do now, I think there are two things that has to be done. The RBI should be fixed on, I think its main job is to contain inflation, and therefore I still feel the estimates say there are about 3 times more of the liquidity in the system, which probably can be squeezed out by increasing the interest rate a little more. The government will have to do more in terms of fiscal measures. One is, of course, it has imposed some kind of imposed a tax, import tax on the import of gold. Therefore, the imports will come down. But this Rupee settlement, which has been recently recently been taken out, that has to be actually taken forward. Qatar, for example, Kuwait, Qatar has today agreed to rupee denomination international trade. And therefore, if the crude oil import from Russia, if it can be somehow denominated in rupee transaction to some extent, then probably this could decrease. Another point is, of course, the fact that the short-term corporate bonds, the automatic access route for foreign capital to buy short-term bonds or government securities, that has to be opened up. The easing of access to Indian market by foreign capital.
Okay. What do you think of the crony capitalism index, Mr. Patnaik? I want to ask you, what do you think of the economist ranking?
I saw that. But you see, the crony capitalism index is a matter of concern. But I think unless you look at the trend, you are giving a position today. So what was the position earlier? And then we also really have to see, for example, Russia, it is at some 30 here, Malaysia, Thailand. So I think we not only have to do a horizontal comparison, we have to do also a longitudinal comparison.
We've gone up in the ranking at least. Amitabh Dubey, what do you think of this? I mean, it's kind of ironic, isn't it, while the rest of us are kind of dealing with this price rise and all the rest of it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, this is quite embarrassing for a government that claims to have ended crony capitalism. I want to just describe one episode which summarizes what stage of crony capitalism we're going through. In March 2019, GVK, which owned Mumbai Airport, challenged Adani's attempt to buy a stake in that airport, which a company is entitled to do, defend its ownership and so on and so forth. And in October 2019, this is a little over 2 years ago, GVK actually went to the markets and raised funds to defend itself against an Adani takeover. In July 2020, just a few months later, the ED and CBI raided GVK across its offices across the country. And 1 month later, GVK sold out to Adani. Now, this is a textbook case of fusion of corporate and political power and crony capitalism. I don't think we can come up with such an example in previous governments. So we can debate the index. Obviously, it's embarrassing that the index went up for the Modi government, but it is this that tells you what is really going on the ground.
Rajat Sethi, want to comment on the index? India's share of billionaire wealth derived from crony sectors rising from 29% 6 years ago to 43%, 29 to 43% in 6 years.
See, I'll give you a more principled stand on this. My principal position is that India's Competition Commission should have more teeth. they should allow more competition and be more proactive on its antitrust laws. There has to be more proactive ways of breaking monopolies which are being created and ensure that a broader ecosystem for startups coming in and challenging the proverbial Goliath, those ecosystems exist. Now, having said that, let me tell you the kind of condition India was in back in the UPA days. We all know how phone banking used to be the means to access of capital, and capital being a formidable factor of production. Anybody who had access to that was successful in emerging as a monopoly. We saw so many such companies, and all of them literally who were scavenging upon access to the state and access to state-sponsored capital have all been bankrupted at this stage. Lanco Solar and all of these, these giant infrastructure companies that were out there. So I would love to see a comparison, an objective comparison with these metrics put out in public, which compares India's position, say, in 2009 to, say, in 2019, and then we can discuss about it. Because otherwise, all of these metrics that these global indices put out are subject to mockery because they believe they have some kind of a fanciful insight into how economies operate, and for some reason they believe that
the economist is the problem.
Sri Lanka is much higher than that of India. These indices are flawed. All are tailored to specific interests, specific lobbying, which happens on the international scale, and I don't give credence to it. As long as it is not thoroughly put out, the methodology and everything put out in public for public scrutiny.
I have to leave it at that today, but I'm going to end the show today reminding everyone that when Mr. Modi was actually Gujarat Chief Minister and the rupee was falling at that time, he had directly blamed the government for the falling rupee, in fact, even accusing corruption in the UPA for being responsible for it. Let's listen in to what the then Gujarat Chief Minister had to say. Good night.
अकेला हिंदुस्तान का रुपया डॉलर के मुकाबले गिरता ही चला गया और क्यों चला गया? और मैंने साफ मांग की है, ये सिर्फ आर्थिक कारणों से नहीं हुआ है, ये आपकी भ्रष्ट राजनीति जो चली है दिल्ली से, उसका इसके अंदर बहुत बड़ा रोल है। हमारे देश का रुपया लुढ़क रहा है, रुपये की कीमत गिरती चली जा रही है। जब अटल जी की सरकार थी तो रुपया 40-42 रुपए की ताकत रखता था $1 के सामने, और ये वर्तमान अर्थशास्त्रियों की सरकार में डॉलर के सामने रुपया गिरता 60, कभी 62, कभी 65, कभी 67 गिरता